Welcome to News from Neptune for April 5th in the 14th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a social democratic government a century ago, said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. That begins by calling things by the right name, particularly in regard to socialism and capitalism. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China notably. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on The Press is Free Except for U.S. Crimes, a Manning and Assange edition. As the U.S. government, contrary to the Bill of Rights, moves to punish truth-tellers who reveal its crimes, imprisoning both Manning and Assange. And there's a report that the WikiLeaks founder is under threat of being removed from the Ecuadorian embassy where he's taken refuge in London and sent to the U.S. to face our unconstitutional punishment for free speech, for free press. It's reported that he faces that expulsion within days. It may be going on right now. There's indeed a watch outside the Ecuadorian embassy in London by sympathizers of WikiLeaks and Assange. And the story is horribly reported in this country, but it goes very deeply to the questions of the suppression of a free press and free speech by the U.S. government, and we should be talking about it more. What's top of your list, David?
Well, at the top, I thought I would sort of try to supplement the comment that you read every week regarding capitalism and Noam Chomsky and whether or not we have capitalism, just to maybe clarify it a little bit. And one way of doing that, I think, is to talk about the notion of rent seeking. And what Michael Hudson, who was a Marxist economist, but who was associated also with the group at the University of Missouri, Kansas City that has promoted modern monetary theory in recent years, talks a lot about rent seeking in his various books and articles and on his website. And he does it as a manner of saying that capitalism was supposed to overturn rent seeking, that the idea of having capitalism, going back to the 1800s in its current form, the idea of having capitalism was that it would undermine the primary form of rent seeking, which was land ownership. So I just Googled, I was lazy, and I just Googled Michael Hudson rent seeking, because I know that there's a lot that he's written about this, and I came to a pithy quote on the blog of someone named Nick Johnson, who I've never heard of, but who seems like a pretty smart guy. There's a lot of smart people out there blogging about various things who I haven't ever heard of. And what he wrote, the quote that he uses from Michael Hudson is the following: a zero-sum activity in one party's gain is another's loss, unlike new capital investment and hiring that expand an economy's production and income stream. The classical meaning of rent-seeking refers to landlords natural resource owners or monopolists who extract economic rent by special privilege without their own labor or enterprise. Neoliberals have diverted attention from the land rent, resource rent, or monopoly rent that classical economists associated with the fire, finance, insurance, real estate sector. They have redefined rent seeking to refer only to politicians and labor unions lobbying for quote unquote special privileges, such as Social Security, a minimum wage, and public programs to meet other basic needs. But these programs have nothing to do with classical rent seeking. They are proper functions of government. And I would only add to that that when you look at the relationship when Chomsky refers to state capitalism and what that means in its many facets, especially militarism as an aspect of state capitalism. And you could certainly define Boeing and other defense contractors as doing rent seeking. It's called cost plus contracts. But beyond that, a Keynesian economist, Dean Baker, refers regularly to rent seeking by pharmaceutical companies. That is, monopolistic practices that Baker equates with taxes. In other words, when we buy our drugs that are patented and that are given these patent protections, these often needless patent protections, what we are doing is paying a tax to the corporation that, of course, isn't called a tax and is never accounted for as taxation as it is when we talk about government taxation. So there are many aspects of this which we need to dig into to understand what state capitalism means, what Chomsky refers to as quote unquote real capitalism, that if it ever existed in only for limited places and times before capitalists themselves undermine the non-rent-seeking aspect of it with the rent-seeking aspect of it through patents, copyrights, banking, hoarding money of various kinds, charging exorbitant interest rates, or charging interest rates at all for borrowing in the sovereign currency. So there's a lot to think about here. But Chomsky is right in saying that we still need to talk about capitalism. But another phrase that Chomsky has used in the past was what he calls RECD, R-E-C-D, really existing capitalist development, and that is what he's talking about, as opposed to talking about capitalism in sort of the naive and sort of innocent terms that he rejects in the statement that you read at the start of our program.
What that statement refers to is the fact that capitalism, as it was analyzed classically by Karl Marx in the middle of the 19th century, really didn't involve the state, the government. It was a private arrangement, if you like, between those who said they owned the means of production, whether it was materials or factories or fields for growing food, or the owners, that is to say the capitalists, capital in this case being productive property like factories and fields. The arrangement, capitalism worked as an arrangement between the owners of capital and the vast majority, the workers who did not own any capital but had only their labor to sell. They sold their labor as best they could to the owners of capital in order to eat regularly. That was the classical capitalist organization that Marx analyzed and described how it was the case that the extraction of what he called surplus value from the worker was the goal of capitalism. And in some ways, the analysis is carried on by the very interesting text recently, Capitalism in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty, who, without buying the entire arrangement that Marx described as the best description of contemporary capitalism, he doesn't think it is, nevertheless talks about how this relationship works out, and indeed works out to the accumulation of wealth in fewer and fewer hands at an accelerating rate at the current moment and into this century. What happened in the meantime, and the point that Chomsky is referring to, is that the government, the state, took over the control of the system of exploiting workers and regularized it, often saying it was working for the workers, but of course it wasn't. It was working for those capitalists, as Piketty describes. The notion of state capitalism went beyond what Marx described. For Marx, the state, the government, was simply the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class. In the actual development of capitalism in the 20th century, the state becomes more and more the actor and establishes that system of rent-seeking that David was describing and protects it. And that's the sort of system that we're in at the moment. The question is, what then is to be done, as someone put it, and the notion that an overthrow of capitalism involves a transformation of this system seems to be right. But what is done in a ameliorative fashion along the way is still an open question, and something that our contemporary politics should be dealing with, and indeed our masters, our rulers, the present-day capitalists who run the state now, are worried about that precisely because they're afraid people may ask that question. And they want to make sure that that question is thoroughly suppressed. Our task here, as Rosa Luxemburg said, is the most revolutionary thing we can do is to proclaim loudly what is happening.
When Chomsky makes the claim that he does about capitalism or state capitalism, I have to refer to his recent movie and book Requiem for the American Dream, which is has a somewhat wistful tone about the 30 years after World War II, which when he was a young man, and when a time during which, for all his criticism of American foreign policy and other aspects of American domestic life, he harkens back to as a time when the government cared more about the people, that we had a kind of welfare state. I don't think he necessarily is calling for a return to that era. I think he is calling for a return to a kind of welfare state in the sort of ameliorative context that you referred to, Carl. But the question remains, and I'm sure he asks it himself as an anarchist, as a libertarian socialist, how do we move beyond the welfare state? Because as long as the welfare state exists within capitalism, whatever's left of it will always be coveted by capitalists, just as they, for example, covet Social Security, which doesn't go into the stock market. They covet that money to go into the stock market, so they could rent seek with that money. They hate Social Security because they can't do rent seeking with those hundreds of billions of dollars that come in and go out every year and are simply transferred from the people who work to the people who are old enough not to have to work.
The reference to Chomsky's biography, and those of us old enough to have met him when he was young, brings up the point that there has been a massive change in the nature of capitalism in my lifetime. And once again, our guide to this is Thomas Piketty, who talks about Les 30 Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, after the end of World War II. Now, there's a hint of irony in what Piketty is saying, because what he's describing is Europe and America in the aftermath of the Second World War, when the massive rebuilding of capitalism, the massive rebuilding of Europe and America after the Second World War was underway. There's a difference, of course. America was largely undamaged by the Second World War, in spite of the tales your grandfather told you. Europe was largely destroyed by the war, and the rebuilding was a major undertaking that required even a good deal of American capital, so that the U.S. had its economic partners in Europe, and it had areas from which it could continue, the U.S. ruling class could continue to seek rent. A destroyed capitalist order was of no use to the American ascendancy, and therefore to rebuild that order was necessary, and that produced the 30 glorious years from the mid-1940s to the mid-1970s, when people's lifestyles distinctly improved, along with the productivity of the state capitalism that existed on both sides of the supposed Iron Curtain. That was a political, a propaganda exercise on the part of the United States. But indeed, the rebuilding was true, and it made a difference, a substantial difference, in the lives of both Americans and Europeans. What happened in the 1970s was a sharp turnaround, consciously ordered by the American ruling class, who felt that this expansion was getting out of hand, in the sense that it was benefiting too many people. It should benefit that capitalist ruling class, who should be allowed to be back in the position of rent-seeking and not dependent upon a state which distributed the benefits of the economic system more broadly. We talk about this as neoliberalism, and it takes a while to explain that term. One of the problems that we have, I think, in this discussion these days is that the language is fairly opaque. Liberalism, in this sense, is a 19th century notion, not the notion that liberalism has been used in the 20th century in this country or elsewhere. It takes a while to explain it, but the important point was that this was a program consciously constructed by the American business class, by the American ascendancy, the American capitalists, to make sure that the rent-seeking was possible and expanding, and that those claims on the economy of the country as a whole that had been honored to some extent in the 30 years after World War II no longer had to be honored. They were successful. Wages in America have essentially been flat since the 1970s in constant dollars, after rising directly and continuously from 1945 to 1975. In the following 40 years, they flattened out, and the development of the American economy left people in a worse position than the expansion extended would seem to promise. That, by the way, is what produced Donald Trump, because it was precisely objections to neoliberalism, however inchoately understood, that produced the populist revolt that brought us Donald Trump. That populist revolt is not limited to the United States; it's going on around the world, and that's exactly what frightens our rulers. They know what's going on. These are not mysteries to the people who run this society. These are not invisible hands, a concept that was not indeed Adam Smith's either. They understand that the hands are quite visible, and they want to make sure it's their hands. Unfortunately, opposition to that by the majority hands is not taking place, and that's what should be taking place. That's not quite right. Let me correct that. It's taking place, but as I say, inchoately, unconsciously almost, and it's appearing in various guises as the populist revolt, both in the U.S. and Europe, that is producing. Well, the line is the sleep of reason produces monsters, and in many cases the populist revolt does produce monsters. Many people say that Trump is one of those monsters. But the fact of the matter is that populist revolt is a extension of the demands for a more economically just society that succeeded the Second World War, and a reaction to the suppression of those demands by the American business class, most notably in the last 40 years. That's what we're in the midst of. And it's a battle by night, because the various forces both are misunderstood and misunderstand themselves in many cases, like the famous Trump base. To give some clarity to this is the sort of job that is necessary for our chief thinkers to do, as someone once said.
That provokes me to refer to an article in the New York Times in the last, I'm not sure whether it was a few days ago or a couple weeks ago, called "Anti-Semitism is Back from the Left, Right, and Islamic Extremes. Why?" That's the title. It's written by Patrick Kingsley, who's the New York Times Berlin correspondent, a young guy from the photo that they have of him, young meaning probably in his 30s. But
I got neckties older than that.
And yeah, yeah, and not having been worn. Right? And the reason I want to bring this up now is that it occurs to me while you're talking, Carl, that the whole anti-Semitism thing doesn't just relate to suppressing criticism of Israel. It relates to suppressing criticism. It relates to suppressing populism in Europe and here.
Yep.
And I'm not sure why that hadn't occurred to me before, but since it's always since it's become so obvious for so long, whenever the topic of anti-Semitism comes up, it's in response to the fact that Israel just doesn't have the reputation that it once did. People question it, whether it's Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders or anyone else over here. So we have to start talking about anti-Semitism, and that's the context in which Norman Finkelstein would critique what he called the new anti-Semitism in the 1970s and the new anti-Semitism in the 1980s, and then going forward to continue to sort of follow this sort of moral panic that seemingly emerges every time Israel's policies are clearly upsetting a lot of people for justified reasons. But historically, there's always been this issue about populism also, and that it goes back to Richard Hofstadter's, the great historian's, critique of the populist movement of the late 1800s, and his mistaken and really propagandistic confusion of what that populist movement really was and where it came from. And so this article reveals that the confusion is added to by the fact that the people that are being accused of anti-Semitism are supporting Israel, are friends with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, who's up for re-election in the next week or two or month or so. Nobody's talking about that all that much, but anyway, let me just read this one quote from Patrick Kingsley's article in the New York Times. It says, "Today, mainstream European and North American politicians, even presidents, premiers, and prime ministers, don't hesitate to flirt with or embrace overtly anti-Semitic messages and memes." That was a quote from a fellow named David Nirenberg, dean of the divinity school at the University of Chicago and an expert on Jewish history. And he's further quoted as saying, "The electoral utility of anti-Semitism feels new to me, newly flexible, and therefore newly dangerous." Very ominous. And then the article goes on to say, Patrick Kingsley, the journalist, goes on to say, far-right parties often portray Jews as a cosmopolitan threat to national identity, especially in regions where the stereotype has been used historically. In Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been able to present the Jewish billionaire George Soros as a secret instigator of Muslim immigration. In Poland last month, a far-right newspaper sold inside the parliament ran a front-page headline saying, "How to spot a Jew," alongside, quote unquote, alongside a condemnation of a historian who researches Polish complicity in the Holocaust. On the far left, and you also have to balance these things, some politicians have associated Jews with the failings of capitalism and conspiracies about supposed control over the global economy. Those complaints are now heard on the fringes of the Yellow Vest movement in France. This is just playing into the worst sort of generalizations about who these people are. And then a couple more sentences, or one more sentence. President Trump himself embodies the contradictions of the moment. Mr. Trump has openly courted white nationalists, saying they include, quote unquote, some very fine people, even as they marched in the style of the Ku Klux Klan, gave stiff-arm Nazi salutes, and chanted slogans like "Jews will not replace us." Of course, the article is referring to the events of Charlottesville in the summer of 2016. So here you have it, but not just in the context of, there's another elaborate article, a very good article by Nathan Thrall in the New York Times about the BDS movement, about the discourse among Jews in this country, about the support for Israel waxing and waning in various ways, and how it enters into U.S. politics. But here, I think this places this whole debate about anti-Semitism in a much more general political context, in the way it's being exploited by the establishment, while the establishments themselves are promoting policies that provoke populism.
You're watching News from Neptune. Carl Estabrook and David Green talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media, with particularly focus today on the economy in long view, and also in terms of specifics to the moment. We have an observation on the latter from our researcher, J.B. Nicholson, who points to an article in The Intercept this week on the gig economy. Most people now know this phrase, the gig economy, as being an example of the sorts of transformations that neoliberalism has brought about in the U.S. It's a response, you might say, to neoliberalism, or indeed another move by American capital to make money from the present economic situation and the neoliberal programs of our government. The article discussed the gig economy companies Lyft, Uber, and Postmates, and there are others like that provide that sort of service. They're racing to file initial public offerings this year, that is basically to sell themselves to the capitalist establishment.
Rent-seeking is what they're doing.
There we are.
Yeah.
A mad dash replete with ever-increasing multi-billion-dollar valuations. But is the rush to start trading on the public markets also a sprint to evade compliance with current labor law? Now, current labor law, we have to realize, is basically what was established in this country as a result of the New Deal and the Trente Glorieuses, the generation after the Second World War, where the response to the last Great Depression was, in fact, taken in hand to some extent by the government in order to prevent a revolution that would demand a more just economic order. Recent financial and lobbyist filings suggest the gig economy giants, like Uber, are hoping to get ahead of a wave of enforcement actions, that is, enforcement actions by the government coming out of the labor laws of the previous generations, ahead of new legislation, ahead of regulatory requirements, and of lawsuits that could force these companies to finally and formally classify full-time workers as employees. That's what the gig economy doesn't do. They're not employing these people. It's just a distant contractual relationship, the equal exchange among economic equals, the driver and the mass company that employs him without admitting it. Virtually every major gig economy company, whether its focus is ride sharing or grocery delivery, has fought to treat on-demand workers, that is, people who do this sort of thing, as independent contractors, regardless of the amount of time they work. The independent contractor classification generally prevents on-demand workers from engaging in collective bargaining and unionization, and allows the industry to avoid paying health care benefits and unemployment, complying with standard workplace rules guarding against harassment, or ensuring mandatory breaks. It's a way to get out from under the labor legislation of the last generations. Despite promises of high pay with flexible hours, rideshare workers have found that they often earn less than $10 an hour after vehicle expenses. Earlier this year, Lyft and Uber drivers faced new pay cuts, fueling unprecedented protests across California. Quote, for a lot of platform companies, like this, profits are predicated in large part on exploiting workers, and people need to understand that. What a surprise, said Maya Pinto, a senior researcher and policy analyst with the National Employment Law Project. You may say this is sort of rediscovering the wheel, huh? These companies either flout labor standards and hope they get away with it, or legally carve themselves out of those standards so they can exploit workers with impunity, close quote. In filings made to the Securities and Exchange Commission, many gig economy firms concede that their business models rely on misclassifying their entire on-demand workforce as independent contractors and get around the labor law. Interesting and important because there are obvious benefits to the sorts of things that these companies are doing, and they raise a lot of questions about the transportation needs of a modern society, which are addressed directly, more directly than we do in this country, in China, for example. Compare Chinese trains and American trains, say nothing, compare traffic in Beijing and traffic in New York, and still there's a long ways to go on these matters. But this gig economy arrangement that is emerging in these U.S. is not an accident. I mean, these firms know what they're doing, and what they're doing is precisely trying to get around the sorts of things that are meant to be protections for workers in this economy. There's a lot more to be said, a lot more to be worked on in this. And it seems to me the next topic, or the topic that it raises, is the one that, to my surprise, keeps turning up in strange places, and that's the topic of a universal basic income. It seems to me that a really clever capitalist who's running a gig economy operation like Lyft might shrug and say, if there were a universal basic income, then people could come work for us if they wanted to, but didn't have to, and we wouldn't have to worry about things like minimum wage laws and whatnot.
Well, there is actually a clever capitalist who does feel that way, and I think you know who I'm talking about. His name is Andrew Yang. And he is running for the Democratic nomination of Democratic Party, and I looked at his website this morning just because I kept hearing his name around and wondering who is this guy in this positive way. And if you look on his website, on his campaign website, he has literally over 100 links to different policy positions that he's thought out or had. You know, he's a smart guy. He's an entrepreneur. He's a high-tech entrepreneur. Something. He's a young guy, in his 40s, and
Yeah.
and he's got it all thought out, and of course, and he supports universal basic income. He supports all kinds of things, medically speaking, educationally speaking, transportation, all kinds of good ideas, all within the framework of improving capitalism. He's not at all saying, I'm a socialist, okay? He's saying, this is what we can do within capitalism. I made all this money, and I'm a smart guy, and but I want everybody to at least have something basic. But of course, what I went to his website looking for, as a footnote to, I don't know if you want to go to the next topic, but just as I went to his website looking for foreign policy, of course. Is he any different on foreign policy? And there's exactly one out of these 100 plus links devoted to kind of a cover statement, a kind of boilerplate statement about foreign policy. I'll just read you one sentence of it to give you what the flavor of it is. While America has undoubtedly made mistakes, we've been a positive force in world history, leading to the spread of peace, prosperity, and democracy. Presidents from JFK to Ronald Reagan maintained strong relationships with allies while sending clear and honest messages to those who would work against us. And then it goes on from there to say we spend too much money on the military, and okay, fine, and we need only to send our soldiers to fight wars when there's a clear goal, and blah, blah, blah. So, I'm sorry, Andrew, you're going to have to do better than that if you want to really gather votes from people who see the big picture.
There is a need, I think, to talk about this collection of odds and sods, as they say in Britain, who have turned up as contenders for the Democratic nomination.
Yeah.
There are a lot of strange things going on there. One of the more interesting accounts of one of the more peculiar, perhaps, member of this group is found in the magazine Current Affairs, edited by Nathan Robinson. You mentioned Norman Finkelstein a moment ago. Finkelstein has dubbed Robinson the cleverest young political analyst in the country.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, which was very
that's
interesting.
High praise from Norman.
Yes, it is indeed. And his magazine is indeed very interesting, and I recommend it highly. I put on a table here in front of us the other magazine that we refer to frequently, Counterpunch, and Current Affairs has some relationship to that. And just to continue the list, two recent books that have come across my desk. Greg Grandin's book about the expansion of America, which very much includes the sort of expansion that the U.S. is working on in Venezuela right at the moment. I recommend it highly. The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America, an excellent collection by a remarkably insightful literary and political scholar. And just by accident, what happens to come, as I say, across my desk, I mentioned Canada by Richard Ford, a 10-year-old novel that I've been meaning to read for most of that 10 years, and finally got around to it this week and was blown away by it. I recommend it highly. Back to political candidates. I mentioned it, first of all, in terms of Robinson's remarkable article about Pete Buttigieg. His biggest problem is getting people to pronounce his name right. I knew the family slightly when I was very young and teaching at the University of Notre Dame. And the best thing about Buttigieg as a candidate is the fact that his father, who was my social friend, was a politically acute Marxist. The son isn't. But in any case, back to the question of...
Reminds me of the Miliband family.
Well, actually, interesting parallels there.
Yeah.
The most interesting person in some ways in this collections these days is Tulsi Gabbard, the Hawaiian representative who apparently, and that's the issue, is an anti-war voice in a collection of candidates or potential candidates that does not include any other anti-war voices, including probably the frontrunner, Bernie Sanders. The Black Agenda report, an excellent political source, has a good article on Gabbard in that it raises the questions about her. Our researcher, J.B. Nicholson, is quite skeptical of Gabbard and has publicized the very real questions that might be raised about Gabbard's anti-war credentials. And Danny Haiphong in Black Agenda Report does the same thing. He is more positive about Gabbard as an anti-war figure than some others, including our researcher is. I'm not sure where I stand about this. I read about her. I'm delighted that she's in the list. She's on the list of contenders, but the hesitations expressed by intelligent observers like our researcher should be taken seriously. In this latest piece in Black Agenda Report, which I recommend in general, by the way, Danny Haiphong calls for the anti-war movement to get Tulsi Gabbard on the debate stage, since she is the sole pro-peace candidate in the presidential primary. But there are questions. One correspondent writes, she's anti-Hawaiian. She's a representative from the state of Hawaii. She's anti-Hawaiian and pro-U.S. military. Dare you to ask any Kanaka Maoli, I had to look that up too, that's a native Hawaiian, or any legit Hawaii-based anti-war person about it. At Po'akuola Island, which Gabbard represents, the military, that was of course the U.S. military, has been using depleted uranium bombs that they send to Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. Also, I'm curious why she's against intervention in Syria and Venezuela, for example, but not against Israel's murderous assault on Gaza and continued genocide against Palestinians. That's an open question. What she actually is saying on that is not clear. She has also shown a capacity for learning, remarkable among American presidential candidates, and is saying some things far better now than she did a few years ago on related issues. If anyone can answer why people here are ready to dispose of Hawaiians, Palestinians, Chamorro, that's South Pacific people in areas controlled by the U.S., or others, I would really love an answer, because I'm pro-BDS, anti-war, and I don't trust someone who volunteered to go kill Iraqis being called a peace candidate. He's referring to the fact that Gabbard is a member of the military and a veteran, in fact, of the American assault on Iraq. It is questionable. It's interesting. She's also smart and well-spoken, and the only member of this group who I think even reasonably can be called a pro-peace candidate. So we should keep the question open while the mainstream media is doing its best to close it.
There's learning and there's learning, Carl. And what Beto O'Rourke, the former congressman from Texas, who's also running for president in the Democratic Party, what he learned after saying some sensible things about Israel-Palestine was not to say sensible things about Israel-Palestine.
Well put.
He flipped real fast when things started getting serious. But beyond that, and I don't mean to make, we're not going to be indulging that much on this program about the specifics of these candidates moving forward. I don't think, although if viewers demand it, well, you know. But what Beto O'Rourke,
Vegas,
I'm unwillingly dragged into finding about some of these people. My curiosity, perhaps perverse curiosity, about some of these people gets the better, or the Beto of me, perhaps. And I read most of a long article from 2007 of all years about him and his family and his wife and his father-in-law in a very good journal called the Texas Observer, which is a good investigative journal. And what it detailed was that it detailed his role as a city council person in gentrifying a certain neighborhood of El Paso, Texas, which he was a council person at the time, and then he also obviously represented El Paso in Congress. And his father-in-law turns out to be one of these guys who developed something called REIT, Real Estate Trust.
Yep.
Back in the 90s probably, or maybe a little earlier, maybe the 80s. Another rent-seeking investment vehicle which made him literally billions of dollars. And so this is the roots that Beto is coming from. Is it Beto or Beto? I don't know. But anyway,
let's call the whole thing off.
This is where he's coming from in terms of his background. He was highly criticized. He tried to protect himself from conflict of interest charges in relation to this development of this neighborhood that was coveted because they needed because people needed a Starbucks to buy coffee from, and okay, so that's going to be put behind him. This was 10, 15, 20 years ago. But still, this is the kind of background that he reminds me of Bill Clinton in this sense. He's, as Alex Coburn used to always say, or that you say, he's this kind of jumped up person that is just, did I get the phrase right? That Alex
I think so.
Jumped up something or other.
Case of Anglophilia.
Yeah, he's just like, and he doesn't really, unlike Andrew Yang, there isn't a whole lot of content to what Beto has to say. He's obviously very smart. He's obviously trying to sell himself as a sort of the next Obama, and the next Obama isn't. I mean, that's problematic in itself, given that a lot of people understand what the Obama experience was really about.
Lying.
Yeah, many other things as well. Yeah.
Exactly. Our researcher also brings us an interesting interview. I'll put all the things we referred to today on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Interesting interview by Abby Martin with an NSA, National Security Administration, whistleblower and former NSA technical director called Bill Binney. Mm-hmm. Binney is a member of this remarkable group of former intelligence agents of the United States for peace, veteran intelligence professionals for peace. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And Binney is also the person who destroyed the notion with his technical expertise, that the Russians had hacked the Clinton emails and pointed out technical reasons why it had to be an inside job probably by the late Seth Rich, and the reason perhaps that Seth Rich is late. Murdered perhaps by those with an interest in the matter, notably the Democratic National Committee. Bill Binney is important on the technical aspects of the activities of the U.S. government, the Democratic Party, and many others. The interview is good, says Jeff Nicholson, and gets into many issues, including war and how the NSA's invasiveness doesn't keep us safe, doesn't protect our civil liberties, and costs us lots of money. How the NSA takes in more data but couldn't properly analyze what they had. Binney's software, stuff he put together, did a better job of managing this, and thus gave him a keen understanding of what the NSA is really after. This means that the NSA has information on where future attacks come from, for example, but without proper analysis, we're not more safe despite giving up so much privacy. How much data they take in daily, 90 billion emails a day, 12 billion phone calls per day, 3 billion a day of which are in the U.S. alone, and the phone calls are automatically transcribed. This is incredible, but this is what the intelligence community is doing. The new Utah Data Center, you may have seen pictures of these massive buildings in the paper. The new Utah Data Center of the NSA is very useful for retaining copies of recordings of calls, emails, and whatever else they wish to retain. But when the NSA claims they don't use the data they collect against American citizens, that's a lie. Binney writes, they're speaking for analysts and NSA. That's the only people they're speaking for, but they don't tell you they left taps in the CIA and FBI and DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and they also didn't tell anybody that the Five Eyes, that is the British spies, Canadian spies, Australian and New Zealand spies, along with American spies. The Five Eyes also had direct access to that database. So all the data they spy on is available to many more parties without any oversight whatsoever, as Binney points out. This is the situation that actually exists over against the lies and disavowals, including lies before Congress by a former director of national intelligence, that the U.S. is doing things like this. Binney and people like him who know what actually is going on here need to be listened to, and I'll place this interview too also on the Facebook page for News from Neptune.
Let me just backtrack for a second here about the Israel-Palestine thing.
Oh, sure.
First of all, just to refer to the article that was in the Sunday New York Times Magazine, which of course is on the website as well, and that's just to clarify, it's called "How the Battle Over Israel and Anti-Semitism is Fracturing American Politics." And the subtitle is "The Growing Prominence of the BDS Movement and the Backlash to It is Widening Fault Lines from College Campuses to Capitol Hill." And again, the author is Nathan Thrall, who's a reputable writer, has written about Israel and Palestine for the London Review of Books a few times, and is well informed. And it is an informative, balanced article. I do want to say two things, just to make it clear from what I was talking about before. I don't take charges of anti-Semitism seriously in any ominous underlying way, as we're supposed to, in terms of anything that might be happening, what people think, what people say, vandalism, and some of the worst things that have happened. I don't take those seriously as indicating a rise of anti-Semitism or a recurrence of what happened in Germany and Europe in the 1930s. And that's what the implications of all of these issues are. And the other thing I would like to say, to make it clear, not that I haven't said it before, is that most of this elaborate debate that's evolved politically in this country that Nathan Thrall writes about very well is simply that. It's about political posturing in this country having nothing to do with actually promoting the rights of the Palestinian people and a just settlement to that conflict. And so I don't care what side of the BDS issue you're on, or how this is playing out in these particular campaigns and so forth. People never get back, and this I would criticize Mondoweiss for this also. They don't get back to looking realistically at what the situation is, as I think Norman Finkelstein and Noam Chomsky want us to do, and understanding that behind all this is U.S. foreign policy. Okay, if you're not talking about U.S. foreign policy, yes, people are talking about the money we give, the $3 or $4 billion we give to Israel every year. People are starting to talk about whether they really, quote unquote, need that, or whether we should be giving that. But that question evades the idea of why we've been giving that for so long, what we get from it, and how that we're never going to have an end to Israel's occupation without a radical change in U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis the whole region.
The question regarding anti-Semitism strikes me as most surprising right now is the remarkable purchase it's had on opposition to the Labour Party in Britain. I would not have believed it was possible to do what's been done by charges of anti-Semitism against the Labor Party in order to retard the possibility of the Labor Party coming to power in Britain in the midst of the Brexit nonsense. The notion that those charges can be taken seriously against Jeremy Corbyn, the head of the British Labour Party, who would be Prime Minister if Labour were to win an election that looks like happening now, that's just remarkable. The only comparison comes immediately to mind is Russiagate in this country, where fantastic charges, fantastic in the literal sense of the word, a matter of fantasy, are weaponized by political interests cynically, and I mean, they know they aren't true, and are used again to restore the fortunes of the establishment in both countries. It's clear that Russ never sleeps. The willingness of the American and British ruling classes to use practically any weapons against the danger that there may be social progress, a rejection of neoliberalism, a rejection of austerity, that's just incredible. But it seems to be the case, and even someone as old as I am astonished in all the things we've seen in the years since McCarthyism that these things work. But they do work. Anti-Semitism in Britain against the left, Russiagate in America against, if not the left, is certainly a populist insurgency, and as contradictory as that may be in this country. It's a realm of fantasy, but fantasy is not a happy one. It's very dangerous.
Yeah. One more. I just want to give, we have about 3 minutes left, I think, 3 or 4 minutes. I want to give a shout out to a former AWARE colleague of ours, a guy named Matt Reichel. Do you recall Matt from AWARE meetings in the early 2000s? He's back in Chicago now, and he was quoted by Paul Street this morning in a recently rare, very good Paul Street column about in Counterpunch about the new mayor of Chicago, and Matt Reichel is quoted as saying, it's a very good article. You read the whole thing. Very critical of Lori Lightfoot, and Matt Reichel.
The new mayor.
Yeah, pardon.
The new Lori Lightfoot, the new mayor.
Yep. New mayor. It's hard, Matt said, not to be skeptical of a former federal prosecutor who spent most of her career siding with the cops in police misconduct cases until she recently decided to opportunistically rebrand herself as a reformer. Paul has a lot of more enlightening and historically contextual and critical things to say about the race between Lori Lightfoot and Tony Preckwinkle and Lori Lightfoot and what this bodes. Very different from even some optimistic I have a feeling that Amy Goodman is probably pretty excited about Lori Lightfoot. I haven't checked it out yet, but that's the contrast that we're dealing with here on the so-called left.
It's good to have a serious analysis of the new mayor of Chicago and the contradiction, is to put no finer point on it, that she represents. You've been watching news from Neptune for the 14th week of 2019, The Press is Free Except for U.S. Crimes, a Manning and Assange edition. As the U.S. government, contrary to the Bill of Rights, moves to punish truth-tellers who reveal its crimes, imprisoning both Manning and Assange. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Crofton Coleman, with Andrew Scollery. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.